Good evening. It's really great to have this conversation tonight. As a member of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee, as a committee member, it's inspiring that to bring tonight's speaker. She has a wealth of information. And you know, many conversations about diversity and inclusion, they do not happen in organizations or in spaces like this or in boardrooms. And this is exactly the space where it needs to happen. It doesn't happen because I think, you know, many people are embarrassed at using unfamiliar words or afraid of saying the wrong thing. Yet this is the place of where we need to have these conversations. And one of the things I've always loved about the Junior League is that we can have these conversations with our members, our sisters, in a space of trust and complete respect. And, you know, diversity starts with a conversation. And tonight we're going to be having that conversation with our speaker, Allison Hector-Alexander. She's the director of the Office of Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at Durham College and works from a feminist, anti-racist, and anti-oppressive framework. Her work centers on equity, diversity, social justice, anti-oppression, allyship, and anti-racist learning. In 2018, Allison co-presented at the Black Portraiture Conference at Harvard University on critical race theory, specifically anti-Black racism. Her work has been recognized by the Durham Diversity Champion Award and the PFLAG Durham Champions Award. Allison is also the recipient of the 2019 Madiba Award. Allison completed her Bachelor of Arts honors degree in adult education and digital technologies and a master education degree with a focus on anti-Black racism, access and equality in higher education for racialized students. So ladies, you can see we have a very experienced, knowledgeable speaker to talk to us tonight. Welcome, Allison.
Thank you. Thank you for the welcome. I am going to share my screen. Is that okay? Can I do that now?
Yep. Do you want me to make you co-host, Allison?
Please, yes. Although I see the button where I can share, so I'm going to do that now. I don't know if you need to take this other. Okay.
Sharing.
There we go.
And just before Allison starts, I just want everybody to know that we are recording tonight's training session for those that can't make it. Thank you, Allison, for agreeing to that.
Okay. And can everybody hear me quite okay? Yes. Okay. So thank you so much for inviting me to speak with your group and dialogue with your group this evening. And just in terms of doing equity work and doing inclusive work, I do want to recognize that, you know, I'm able to have this conversation with you on the territories of traditional Indigenous lands. And this is part of the way that I do equity work. I do recognize that, you know, I'm able to enjoy the privilege and the benefits of learning and teaching on the traditional territories of the Mississaugas of Squamish Island First Nation and the land that are covered under the Williams Treaty. And so I recognize that I'm able to do that by way of immigration and being a Canadian by way of immigration. So I usually start my sessions with that because that in itself recognizes that, you know, a lot of the conversations that we have has to start off from colonization and the impact of when we talk about equity and diversity, what does that mean for Indigenous communities? So I'm going to try to cover, you know, quite a bit and introduce different concepts to you, some things that you're probably, you know, already aware of, but let's have a dialogue. Don't hesitate to, you know, put your question in the chat or stop me. I will stop midway through and see what questions we have and how we can dialogue. And then we'll continue the conversation and see where that takes us. So also setting the tone to say that there is no wrong question. I am receptive to every question that you can possibly have around, you know, when we're talking about social identity and equity and anti-Black racism and racism. Please ask your question. I hope that this is a brave space where you do feel comfortable with your, you know, with your other sisters, with your other members that you can have this conversation with. And so I really like this quote by Richard Jenkins, who says that, without social identity, there is in fact no identity. And it's really important that we understand how we come into spaces. So that is very foundational. How do I come into a space? And when I say, how do I come into the space? What is my social identity? And so I use the protected characteristics from the Ontario Human Rights Code, those 16 protected grounds, to help people recognize and identify, how are you occupying space? How are you taking up space? What is your race? How do you recognize your ethnicity, your ancestry, your gender? What is your sexual orientation, your family status? And I ask that because that is important to see how we navigate the world and the lens that we use to actually experience the world. So hold on to that as we engage, as we have conversations, as I share some of these concepts. What is your social identity? And also recognizing that as you come into the conversation, as you come into, the learning. I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. Can everybody turn off their mics, please? Or mute themselves? Yeah, there's just some feedback. And that as you're coming to the conversation, that you also recognize that we're not coming as simplistic beings, in that we're coming with intersectionality. We're coming with all of ourselves. And so it is that intersectionality that allows us to be all of ourselves in spaces. We're coming with, our gender and our sex and our sexual orientation and our race, our family status, if we're parents, or marital status, or religious beliefs, or abilities, or any sort of disabilities that we might be living with. And so, Kimberly Crenshaw does a lot of work, or developed the concept of intersectionality, that recognizes that, even though I identify as a woman, my experience with all of you here would be very different. And I think sometimes people try to put us into boxes and frame us because of one identity, and not recognizing that we're coming as whole beings. And so that's also important to recognize, because, again, even though we have the same family status, we might be a similar age, we might, recognize the same religious observance. Even though all of that is equal, our experiences will still look very different because of those intersectionality. And so recognizing that. And also recognizing as well that because of those intersectionality, because of the lived experiences that we have, because of the things that we were taught as children, because of the things that we received from our community, because of the information that we consume from the media, we have implicit biases, and that we have unconscious biases, and that we do work and be intentional about doing work that will help us recognize what these implicit biases are. And so we all have the biases. We need to recognize we have the bias. We need to own that we have these biases. And when we're talking about implicit bias, we're talking about the disconnect between who we're saying we are and what our behavior looks like. And so when someone says, I don't have a racist bone in my body, I could never be I'm not a racist, but the action or the behavior says something very different. There's some kind of unconscious bias happening here. When somebody does not want to work with, another individual because there's something about the person's social identity that either makes them uncomfortable, or have them have their backs up on the wall, or be defensive, there is some sort of disconnect. And so this is where, the self-awareness is really important. What am I feeling? Why am I uncomfortable? Why is this person making me uncomfortable? What does this person represent that makes me uncomfortable? And so we have to be very honest with ourselves around, what is going on? How, what is the disconnect? Why is me saying that, I am not I'm not a racist, or I'm not an ableist, or I'm not a homophobic person, but my behavior says otherwise. My language says otherwise. The feeling says otherwise. The way that I might exclude another group says otherwise. And so we have to hold on to that and recognize what is happening with these biases. And that we know that biases are pervasive. We know that everyone possesses them. If you want to do further work around just recognizing in a personal way your own biases, Harvard University has an implicit bias, and it's a very quick test that you can take on. You can do that through your computer. I would recommend this for anyone. Do it a couple of times. see what comes up for you, see what looks different for you, given what is going on in the world around you, given what's going on in your life. And so we recognize that. And one of the hardest thing, in my role as someone who investigates or fact find incidents or complaints of discrimination or harassment, it is those implicit bias pieces that makes my job can be very challenging, because many times people don't necessarily recognize the implicit bias. The explicit pieces we can name, we can concretely name, we can say, here's what's going on. But when it's the implicit piece happening, you're either, somebody has to have the awareness that this is happening, and that behavior has to be named for them. So the awareness piece is important in recognizing that in yourself. And of course, we generally tend to hold implicit biases that favor our own in-group. So, so the people who look like us, the people who share the same race as us, the people who share the same ethnicity as us. And so what does that mean for other folks that you're working with who might, come into the conversation with a very different social identity than you do, or very different intersectionality? Right. And so being mindful of those pieces as you engage with each other, but also as you engage with community. And so recognizing, as I said, that the social identities, really influences our lens, right? We see the world really as we are, not necessarily as it is. It's through our lens, and what really influences our lens, what really, impacts the way that we see the world are those identities, those social identities. And so, many times when people talk about either their experiences of oppression or ways that they might, well, we don't necessarily talk a lot about the ways that we enjoy privilege, and I'll get to that. But we talk about oppression. We talk about, oppression, whether it be around socioeconomic status and poverty, oppression around access and not having access to, to services or resources because of ability. We talk about oppression in the context of racism. We talk about oppression within the context of sole support parents or single parents, and not necessarily having, adequate childcare, not having, access to adequate, affordable childcare. So our social identities, there are ways that we experience oppression because of the identities. But at the same time that we experience oppression, we're also enjoying privilege because of those identities. And the both of them can happen at the same time. Right. And so, and I'll give you examples as we go into it, but I want you to think of, looking at those social identities, how have you experienced oppression? Have you experienced oppression? So think about that. Think about your social identity, but think about the ways that you have either been excluded. Think about the ways that you have been denied access, denied benefits, denied a seat at the table because of your social identity, whether it be age, whether it be ability, gender. When we're talking about gender as well, we're talking about gender identity and gender expression, and we're talking about sex, where we talk about the biology, male, female. And of course, we know that when we're talking about gender, we're talking about binary, non-binary individuals. So, keep that in mind. And when we do talk about race, many times and historically, we've connected race to biology. The research has completely dismissed that idea. Race is a social construct. So when you're thinking about race, think of the characteristics, think of the way that arbitrarily characteristics have been attached to folks based on the color of their skin. And so the idea of race within biology, this is what was used to enforce slavery. This is what was used to ensure that, people of African ancestry were kept working in the fields for long days, because there was this idea that their bodies, our bodies, and I say our as my ancestors, could stand it, could stand being in the sun, doing the work for long periods of time. We see it manifest in our society today where, there are many women. I recently read a report of women, racialized women, who go through childbirth and might be saying, I need additional medication, and being told that that's not what you need, not having the agency over their bodies. And so women, as per a Toronto public health report, are 4 times more less likely to have a family physician as opposed to other women. right? So think of how this continuation, this perpetuation, that race is somehow connected to biology, and therefore Black folks, racialized folks can withstand more pain because their bodies are built differently, because our bodies are built differently, and that is not the case. Right. And so race is a social construct. It is that classification, based on, the people in power, the structures who assign these arbitrary, characteristics to folks because of that, of color of our skin, because of our physical attributes. And so despite that, and so the Ontario Human Rights Commission, back in 2009 said, despite the fact that there are no biological basis for race, the social construct, it's a powerful force with real consequences, because there's a dominant group that believes that because of the construct of race, that another group is inferior. And so we really have to understand the historical context, the connotation attached to race. And I think it's some of these conversations that we need to start to have in really honest ways, because I think people are uncomfortable, having some of these conversations. And, being uncomfortable and the discomfort is not a bad thing, because we need to talk about it to get comfortable talking about race, right? Race should not be the R word that we don't want to approach, we don't want to take on, we don't want to engage in conversation. And because race informs our experiences, right? So if we're to think of oppression, within the identity of race, think of how, that, informs our experience, whether it be for oppression or for privilege, right? And so when we're talking about racism, I say think of racism as an upside down pyramid. We have to we focus for a very long time on individual and interpersonal actions and behavior. So therefore, this person said this to me, this person perpetrated this behavior. And so therefore we focus on those interpersonal interactions, right? We have to look at race from the structural, societal piece first at the very top, because it is those legislation, it is the rules, it is the policies, it is the people in power who are creating these policies that prevents access, that perpetrates this arbitrarily application of different characteristics to folks because of the color of their skin. And so that structure, that societal working reinforces our systems. So that reinforces our policies, our practices, the way that our system operates, who gets to participate, who gets to advance, who gets access. And it is that system that empowers and emboldens individual for the interpersonal interactions where racism is perpetrated. And so that is important that we look at racism when we're talking about racism, that we shift it so that the focus is and that is where you might hear a lot of conversation around dismantling systemic racism. We can talk about the individual interaction. We can, raise awareness. So folks are very much aware of their attitudes, of their beliefs, right? Of their selective information and biases that they've developed. However, if the system continues to empower and reinforce that perpetration of unfairness and that perpetration of exclusion, that perpetration of violence against Black bodies and racialized bodies, then we continue to go through the cycle. We're spinning in a cycle because the structure is not looked at. Who is creating, who's developing the legislation, right? And so if you were to think of it, if somebody is saying that I'm going to, support you, but I'm not going to really ask you any questions about what you need. So I'm just going to create this for you. How does that person take my lived experience or a lived experience into consideration in building legislation? And if the folks who are creating these systems don't recognize certain people as a whole body, because for a number of years, Black folks were not seen as an entire being, right? We were seen as 3/4 or sometimes half a person. Were recognized as half, or there are many of my ancestors were recognized as half a person. Other racialized folks as well have gone through that as well. And so if the bodies up there who are making the decisions don't recognize the value of everyone, then it continues to be perpetrated. So who's making the decision? Nothing for us without us, right? Keep that in mind when we're engaging different people who might have different lived experiences than we do. It's important that we create a seat at the table for those folks, right? This is the time that we shift our chairs down and we say, come to the table, we want to hear your voice. And how can I amplify your voice? Right. And of course, when we're talking about anti-Black racism, sorry, it is looking at the way the prejudice, the attitudes, the beliefs, the stereotyping that is directed at African people of African descent. And it is rooted, it has become so normalized that it is rooted in that unique history of slavery and colonization. And we know, and for the people who dismiss racism or dismiss anti-Black racism, that it doesn't exist, it is entrenched in Canadian institutions and policies. And we have to recognize that and we have to own that. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday who said that slavery never existed in Canada. Slavery existed in Canada. Slavery was abolished in the early 1800s. And even then, when it was abolished, and in Ontario was one of the first places it was abolished in Canada at the time called Upper Simcoe, even then that there were parameters around who was really free. And so the existing slave didn't get to be free. Their children would be free when they turned 25, right? And so we really need to educate ourselves to recognize, the history, in Canada, because a lot of the conversation is around, people say, thank God we're not like our neighbors down south. And I say, well, we're different. As Canadians, we do polite well, which means that we do subtle racism very well. We do subtle sexism, subtle isms in a very polite way. So we do it very differently. And we have to acknowledge that. For us to move the needle and do anything different, we really have to acknowledge that. And that is where microaggressions come into play. That subtle everyday jabs, the invalidation that, you don't belong. And microaggressions play out with race, with sex, the idea that, a successful woman, like, well, how did you get here? What did you do to get here? Or, somebody making these subtle jabs at someone, who's a sole support parent, right? Or, somebody who's part of the LGBTQ plus community. So it's those subtle invalidations and assaults and insults of that, that takes its toll. It's consistent. So people make jokes and they think it's funny, but it's targeting one of your social identities or many of your social identities. And so how do these show up? How do these microaggressions show up, in your work, show up in your in your volunteerism, in your engagement with each other, but also with community? And so how do we move that needle away from saying, you know what, I am not racist. I have Black friends. I don't have a racist bone. I don't have, a homophobic bone in my body. How do I actually action that? Right? How do we take those steps? Like right now, having this conversation around actively being anti-racist. So moving away from, I'm okay, I'm good, I'm not racist, but now how are you actively anti-racist? And so Dr. Ibram Kendi does some really great work around walking us through how do we become anti-racist, right? We have, some of us are in the fear zone, and that is okay. This is a discomfort. We're starting to question and really look at our own biases. How did we develop these biases, and what responsibility do we have now to really unlearn some of the biases? Because unlearning will take energy. It takes time. It has to be intentional. It's hard work. It's not easy work, right? And so do you want to unlearn some of the harmful things that you were taught, or the information that you've consumed? And so how do we move from the fear zone into the learning zone, into asking questions, into reading, into really understanding what are your own biases, and how do you come with privilege into this interaction? And then, of course, not being, so scared that, you might say something wrong that you don't do anything about it, right? Moving beyond the fear, moving beyond, I might make a mistake, and looking at how do you use your privilege to amplify the voices of other marginalized folks who historically did not have a voice, right? And so looking at privilege is important that we understand it and we recognize it. And many times when I introduce privilege, folks will say to me, well, I feel like, I feel guilty, like, recognizing that I have this privilege, and it should never be about guilt. When I introduce privilege, I want you to think of What are those assets? What are those benefits that you enjoy by the mere fact of the social identity that you have? And as I said, we can enjoy privilege. At the same time, we might experience oppression in different ways. So we might experience, racism or sexism, but we enjoy being cisgender. We enjoy, being, in a traditional family. We enjoy, being observing a dominant religion. So we have to look at the ways that these things happen and they show up in spaces and then they operate. So my privilege, I recognize my privilege as someone who is, educated, as someone who is employed, as someone who is in, as I said, employed, cisgender, able-bodied. As someone who's presently able-bodied, I have to understand my privilege, because then I need to use my voice as somebody who's presently able-bodied to amplify those who live with disabilities. So how do I use my voice as somebody who's cisgender for my friends or colleagues who might be trans, who might be transitioning? How am I using my voice as somebody who's cisgender? So those are the things that, I want us to think about. How do we use our voice to amplify other marginalized groups' voices? And so think of your privilege. Think of your privilege, as folks who are employed, who are gainfully employed, as I said, who are able-bodied individual. How are you using your whiteness? What does that look like? How do you amplify the voices? How do you show up in the spaces where there are, other women, racialized women, Black women who might be struggling with, watching somebody who looks like their partner or their dad or sibling or their child be killed on television? And how do we show up and check for those people to see that they're okay and that they're handling, that they're surviving, that they're continuing to navigate it, but also showing up in a space very heavy hearted. We saw that, Public Health Toronto recognized the trauma from racism as a health crisis. Right. And so the trauma that comes with having to navigate a world where we're experiencing racism, whether it be microaggression, whether it be full or explicit racism, whether it be implicit and indirect racism, these are the things that we have to recognize. So how are you using your whiteness? Are you using your whiteness to amplify voice, or are we using our whiteness to weaponize folks? And we saw, how whiteness can be weaponized through the Amy Cooper incident in Central Park, a while ago, where the man was bird watching and she, tried to weaponize. And when I say weaponize, recognizing what was going on around us in the world, but calling the police and lying to the police, knowing that if the police were to come, given the history of how racialized and Black bodies are policed, that they would sooner believe her than the Black man. So how do we use our whiteness? How do we use our privilege that we have, right, to amplify voice of historically marginalized folks? And recognizing our power, the positional power that you might have as leaders. What does that look like? The historical power that your ancestors, held, what does that look like? How are you using that? Your own personal power. How do you use your power? And just being part of an organization like yours, of volunteerism, of giving back, of advocacy, that you give, the community building. How are you using your power? And Julie Diamond does some really great work, where she talks about, your positional power is your license to act, but your personal power is your ability to lead. And how do you apply that to your work? How do you recognize the space that you're taking up when you walk into a room? And so it is through that allyship that we'll look at, how we support people, how we amplify voices. And I'm pretty sure that this is work that you do through your organization, through your volunteerism. But when you're doing allyship, it's important that when you come into the space, when you walk into the space with all of yourself, with the ways that you experience oppression, the ways that you enjoy privilege, that you do authentic allyship. That it is not performative, that it's not we're checking off a box, that we're not thinking that we're putting on a cape and we're going to save anyone. It shouldn't work that way. It shouldn't center around us. It shouldn't come from that place where I'm doing somebody a favor. If we're looking at how can I use my voice as best possible to really create opportunities, to really create space so folks who haven't historically had a voice can find a voice, then it has to center on the group that we're working with. And that allyship is not easy work. Allyship is consistent, ongoing work. We don't get to identify ourselves as ally. The people that we're supporting are the ones who should recognize our efforts, right? And recognize that we are trying to be allies and that we ask those folks, how can I help you? What do you need? How can I support you? And so, you know, when we're doing authentic allyship, as I said, discomfort is not a bad thing. The conversations that you'll continue to have, you know, around equity and around diversity, sometimes will make you uncomfortable because you will look at how have you benefited from ism? Right? Have you benefited from racism? What does that look like? How do we unlearn certain behaviors? You know, how do we adopt behaviors that are, you know, creating space for people that are not harmful for people? So look at your own practices, look at your own policy. Who does it exclude? Who does it create space for? Right? Who does it deny a seat at the table? And that is important as well. And that we're committed to the work because it's not easy work. If it's easy work and we can just, you know, do a check mark and move on, we haven't done it well. Right? So because we're looking at, you know, centuries and years of oppression. And so how do we take our time, you know, with the work and be gentle with ourselves when we're doing the work, because it's hard work, right? But be supportive of the groups that we're trying to help. And so as leaders in your community and engaging in the work that you're doing, engaging in your advocacy work and doing it with respect and with dignity and doing community building and working with each other as well as sisters, as members, you know, what does that look like? And so, you know, having the conversation, recognizing that you're coming to this with bias. We're all coming into it. We need to own it. We need to recognize it. And we look at what do I do with that bias? The curiosity of learning, of, you know, building new ideas, looking at how do I, what growth needs to happen, and not letting the idea that we might not get it right the first time stop us from acting. The cultural intelligence, how are we asking respectfully to learn about, you know, different groups that we're trying to support, that we're trying to create space for collaboration, community. I always say collaboration is important. We shouldn't have to do all of the work, the learning, the unlearning, the unpacking, the engaging. We can collaborate with each other. And that we're committed to the work because we know it takes hard work. We know that we have to show up and be brave, you know, because it's not easy work. And sometimes we might, you know, it might, you know, not work the way we wanted to. We take that L and we come back and we review, we re-strategize, and that we go back at it again because it does take work. There has to be that commitment to wanting to do better, right? And then of course the courage, you know, the strength, the bravery, sorry, that it takes to actually do the work. So I'm going to pause now because I haven't been able to check to see if there are questions in the chat. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for now, and I'm going to, so Joan Smith said, do you agree with Ibram Kendi when he says we're either racist or anti-racist, and that there is no being non-racist, and that unless we're taking responsibility to create change and work to get racist policies? I don't particular. So we actually invited Dr. Kendi to speak at in September with our students, and he really unpacked that piece about, you know, being actively anti-racist. And I think, you know, he spoke more to the idea of the silence being complicit. You know, if we're not engaging in a particular way and we're seeing racism being perpetrated, we're seeing, you know, Black bodies falling, you know, the number of Black bodies that we've lost in the last little bit. And so if we're not actively looking at our own practices, if we're not actively looking at the way that we're engaging, if we're not saying anything, then there's some responsibility there that we hold, but not, I don't think that makes us racist, but I think there's a responsibility that we have, a social responsibility to look at how we can be actively anti-racist. How can we learn? What resources are available to us? Where do we ask for help with resources? And how do we respectfully engage with folks who are dealing with the trauma of watching, you know, these things, of hearing of another, you know, Black man being shot or killed or, you know, left to die. And so there is that trauma. And so how do we engage and have conversation and learn about those pieces? Any other questions for me? Anything came up for you that you had comments or any questions about? And I know I sort of introduced like, you know, these concepts and privilege and social identity and moved, you know, through it, you know, quickly. But you know, I am happy to share resources, you know, if you're looking for resources, but, you know, and I know that there were a few questions. I know one of the questions was around sort of, you know, how, you know, as someone who identifies as a white woman, how am I perceived by, you know, racialized women? And one of the things, you know, that I continue to think about it, and I think, well, how do you engage with racialized women? Are you mindful of the space that you're occupying? Are you amplifying voices of other racialized or Black women? Do you recognize your privilege? Because I think not I think, when we're enjoying privilege, and this was for any ways of privilege, that any form of privilege that we might be enjoying because of our social identity, we don't think about it. The privilege has become so normalized that we enjoy it. It is when it gets disrupted. It is when there's a threat of it being dismantled. It's when there's a threat that, you know, we might not continue to enjoy. That's when we start to think about it. You know, so I always say, you know, if you were to think of being an able-bodied individual, you park your car, you walk to where you need to go, snowing, whatever, you know, you wear the boots that you need to wear for the season, right? It starts to snow, you wear your boots, right? If for any reason that you know, you slipped on the ice or whatever, and now you're using a mobility device, you're using a walker, using a cane, that is when you recognize. That is when you recognize the experiences of folks who have historically been marginalized, of folks who've had to make sure that the door openers are working, that the snow is cleared properly, because we don't think about the things when we're enjoying it. It's when it's disrupted. It's when there's been a shift. And so it's the same thing when we talk about race, or it's the same thing when we talk about, you know, gender identity or gender expression, right? And so it is that we're mindful of it. Again, as I said, you know, it's never about guilt. It's never, because again, when you really think of it, and I say to folks, there shouldn't be guilt attached to, you know, exploring privilege and understanding the power that we hold, because we do have it. And so we need to recognize it. But what are we doing with it? Because the idea that I'm presently able-bodied, I can't take that away and give it to somebody who isn't, right? I can't do that. But what I can do is that I can amplify voice. I can be sure that when, you know, the snow hasn't been cleared properly, that I can pick up the phone to our facilities department to say, hey, I know that there are a few people who will need to access the campus, and that they can't, because they can't get onto campus if the snow isn't clear, if the door opener isn't working, or the elevator isn't working, and I booked a meeting on the 4th floor. I need to be mindful of that, because as a privileged body person, I can run upstairs, right? I can run up the stairs if the elevator isn't working, but that person who uses the wheelchair, you know, cannot do that. And so I have to be mindful of these things, right? You know, when I talk about that, there are certain spaces that, you know, friends who are LGBTQ plus, who are part of that community, there are certain spaces they won't go because it's not safe for them, right? And so, you know, I might think about that safety, maybe because of my sex, identifying as a woman or woman identified, or because of my race, not because of my sexual orientation, right? And so these are the things that we definitely, you know, we want to be mindful and be more aware of how we operate, how we occupy space. And while we're occupying the space, who do we need to create some space for? Right? That is important. Who do we need to support? And even when we create the space, that person, if historically they haven't had that power or felt that personal power, we still need to nudge them to help them find their voice as well. And so again, as I said, how do we use, you know, you know, our personal power? How do we use the positions that we have? How do we use our race or our whiteness or a cisgender, you know, everything that you sort of think in terms of dominant groups? How do we use those characteristics? How do we use those grounds to create opportunities and to support the people that we're saying that we're here to help? So we have to, you know, the work that we're doing cannot be performative. It has to be authentic. And then the thing is that when we're doing authentic work, it's hard work. It is uncomfortable work. It gets us to question how we've benefited, right, from privilege, how we've benefited from policies that have harmed and excluded other people, how we've benefited from legislation that have, you know, excluded or denied access to a whole group of people. So that it gets us to start to question around, oh my God, I have benefited from this. So now what do I do now? What do I do now? How do I use any sort of privilege or power that I have? How do I use that to support anyone? Okay. Question. Okay. So Maggie said that this is my answer for the question of what is my ethnicity is Canadian. Though I'm white, I did include that category in my response because I consider my whiteness to be part of the social construct of race and not part of my ethnicity. What does this classification say about me? It says that you're recognizing the social construct of race, that it speaks to that. But I would also want it to speak to that you also recognize the privilege that comes with being white, the privilege that comes with whiteness, and being mindful of, how do you amplify a voice, recognizing that. I know that I read an article last night that spoke about, the balance that we create, or the balance that we created for privilege. And specifically, it spoke to white women that, in as much as, we're having this conversation, it's important conversations for us to have, but that we also don't take over the conversation. I thought that was really interesting as well. It sort of reminded me, and it reminds me, for I work with students, so that reminds me all the time that I have all these great ideas that I think are amazing. And sometimes when I tell the students, they're like, no, right? But I have to remember that I need them at the table. So I might have the idea, but I need their thoughts. And so it's the same thing when we're talking about, amplifying and being right there with your racialized sisters, with your Black sisters, and so on. Ask them how you can support them, because you have really great ideas, and that's great, right? But have that conversation so that you're not taking over that conversation, so that they also, have that right. I remember when, I'm trying to think of exactly when it was, but I think it might have been around 2016, when you had, all these women went to Washington for the march, and everybody wore, the pink hats, and, everybody talked about, excuse my language, pink pussies, and wore pink hats. And you think, well, where are the racialized women? And do they have pink? Like, you have to think of who is at the forefront. And it has that, there's a very long history of first wave, second wave feminism, where Black women and racialized women did a lot of work. And when the benefits of that came, racialized women were nowhere to be benefiting from that. And so we have to understand our history and what that has meant, and so that we don't repeat the things that we've done before, right? And so it is that, reminding, women who do want to be at the forefront and want to support, racialized women, Black women, people living with disabilities, that we can be there to support, but we have to be mindful that we're not taking over, right? And we're doing this together. Right. So yeah, so the classification is, you recognize that there is a that race is a social construct, but I also want you to recognize the privilege that comes with it. And that, of course, like if you look at your ethnicity and you recognize your ethnicity as Canadian, absolutely, but also please recognize that as well. And I also know, because of your intersectionality, there might be other ways, visible and invisible, that you might experience oppression. Right. And so that we recognize, because I know that it's also important that when we're talking about diversity, we don't just focus on the top of the iceberg, we look below sea level as well. Because we know people you can't see all areas of diversity. So if I don't disclose to you, that I'm a cisgender person, or I'm in a heterosexual relationship, like if I don't disclose, you don't know that, you can't see that. Right. And so these are the things that we want to be mindful of, is what are the areas of diversity, are we dealing with? Because sometimes when we say things, and that's how microaggressions sometimes show up, because I don't think people really intend to harm folks, right? And so we say things, right, that we think, oh, that's just a joke, but it might be a joke because you haven't experienced, something traumatic because of your social identity. And so when someone has said, nobody's laughing, then we need to stop. Right. So will we get it wrong sometimes? Absolutely. But when we know better, we do better. Right. So there's another question. Do you see human resources practices in companies changing to ensure hiring practice? Absolutely. I'm in the process right now of navigating a review of our hiring practices, anywhere from where do we post? What does our tagline say about, engaging with diverse groups? Who's on our hiring and our selection committees? Are they trained, conscious bias training? Because of course we favor people within our own in-group. So therefore, when we look at resumes, or we're reviewing resumes, there's a YouTube video, and I can always share that with you. But there's a video that speaks to implicit bias in hiring practices, and a study that was done in the UK where, resumes were sent out with the way that we send our resumes with our names and all of that. And people waited to hear back and didn't hear back. And then the research study looked at taking the same resumes, taking off names, and then using blind, so pretty much blind reviewing the resumes, and a very different outcome. Right. And so we need to train our HR, professionals in hiring practices around conscious bias, but also being able to understand how racism shows up in our spaces, how other isms show up. So one of the things that we've heard about is that, somebody going to HR to say, this person said this to me and it was sexist, or it was racist, or it was ableist, or it was Islamophobia, anything along those, and people dismissing it. And I don't think they're dismissing it because of ill will. I think they're dismissing it because they do not understand the concept and how it shows up. So a lot of time people expect the explicit, direct ways that racism shows up, and it doesn't always show up in the direct way. And I can tell you, I've been doing this work over 10 years now. And if I were to think of all the cases that I've investigated or fact find, the hardest part of my job is really unpacking indirect racism, the subtle indirect racism, or the microaggressions that you're questioning. Is this what's happening? I feel like, I've been excluded in this way, but I'm not really sure that this is what is happening. And you're questioning if that is why you're being excluded, or why you're being denied access, or being denied a seat at the table. And so that is the hard part. The thing about it is, as I said, we do indirect ism really well in Canada. Right. And I've seen that. I've heard that from my counterparts, in that, the thing about what I hear from my counterparts in the South, or our neighbors in the US, is that the explicit piece is way more very direct. I will call you, the N word. I'll call you a B word if you're a woman. I'll call you, right. And so it's very explicit. And that's the complete opposite for us here. So that education has to happen, so that people understand this is how it shows up. Right. And really taking the time to unpack it, right? Unpack it layer by layer before dismissing someone who says, this is what is happening. Right. So absolutely, there has to be changes around how we recognize racism when it shows up. Okay. And all bias isn't bad. Sometimes I have a preference towards something. I'm not harming anybody. We have preference, right? It's human nature. It's when that bias either progresses to prejudicial behavior. Somebody says, I should work with you because you're part of my team and we're colleagues, or I'm just going to stand you. But I have these biases because of the selective information that I received as a child, as a young adult, the information that I consume from the media, and I always say to people, critical, and of course I'm coming from, academia, but I always say critically think of who is giving you the news, because the news that you're receiving is through the lens of another individual. So you sort of know, like, if you were to go out with your friends and, you all witness the same interaction, but you might see all three would probably have a different way of retelling it, is because you're seeing it through your lens. Right. And so, for someone who might dismiss something and say, oh, I wasn't really bothered by it, somebody who's had a traumatic experience in another matter might be way more heightened. So we're seeing it through our lens. And so what are we receiving? How are we critically looking at it? And so we all come into situations with bias. I think it's a matter of, can my bias be harmful? Does it exclude anybody? Can it perpetrate a situation where somebody does not have access or advancement or, development, personal growth? How can that bias harm someone? Am I not, offering the same service? And I'll give you an example. A few years ago, maybe about 4 years ago, we had a mandate from the government around developing sexual violence policy, learning modules for students on our campus. So the government of Ontario had It's Never Okay action plan around sexual violence and learning about consent. And so I was doing all of this training, and I had a student come to my office and said, Allison, I really want to talk to you about a situation that happened to me on the weekend. And I said, okay. And then she started telling me, and she said, well, one of the things that I've always wanted to do, I've always wanted to have a threesome. And I thought, oh, and right away, right when she said that to me, something was happening for me, because I was like, I'm sitting there, I'm thinking, okay. And she said, well, this is what happened. And I said, okay. And I had to think of, how does what she shared with me impact the service that she's going to receive? And that should never, whatever, I'm thinking, whether this is not my lived reality or not, because it's not my lived reality. So it shocked me for a minute, right? That should not impact the level of service that she would receive. Whether or not somebody has a very different lived experience than you are, the fact of the matter, my question to her was, did you give consent? No. Okay, here's what we need to do. Like with any other person who come forward, whether it be a twosome, a threesome, or foursome, whatever the situation was, but it wasn't my lived reality. And so I caught myself right away around, I was uncomfortable, right? But that should not impact my interaction. So I catch myself, allow myself to be uncomfortable, but provided the same level of service. And so, who do you trust that you can have these honest conversations about that? I felt uncomfortable in that moment. What was going on? Check in yourself. Where's your discomfort? Where are you used to feeling your discomfort? Right? So we do, check yourself is what I would say in terms of how we, who are people that you trust, that you can say, this happened today and here's what I think happened, and have somebody, be honest with you, that they can be as honest with you to receive, what they're trying to say to you. Right? But we do have it. We walk into spaces, in our spaces with it, in our work, volunteerism, in our recreation. Every day we walk with our own biases. I think it's a matter of being aware that we have it, being honest, trying to learn more about our unconscious bias, right? And recognizing how it operates, how it shows up. Okay. Another question, one of my friends applied for a job and they made her send in her results before they asked her for a second interview. I tried doing some of the tests myself. Here's the link, just agree to the terms on the set and you can, yes. And I recommend that people do it sometimes at different times. I don't know how I feel about asking somebody to do that test and sending it in for a job interview. I think a conversation, and this is very, like I have recommended the Project Implicit test to everybody, like any session that I've done, but I remind people that it's a very private thing, because especially if you're just starting to unpack it, I don't know if I would want to share that, because again, if somebody were to come to me and say, Allison, this is one of my biases. This is where, I don't know where this came from, but here's my bias, but I'm actively doing work to unlearn, some of that bias or the bias. Then you really have to come from a place where you're sort of recognizing, okay, you want to put in the work. You're committed to the work, right? You're recognizing it will be uncomfortable, but you're committed to the work, and then we can have a conversation. But to just send the results in, there has to be some follow-up, some context, some conversation. You know what I mean? I know quite a few places right now, what they're doing is that they're asking folks to self-identify in terms of your areas of diversity, right? They're asking folks so that, many organizations as well are doing self-ID, self-identification, diversity self-identification surveys, or they're also doing census as well. So I know a lot of education institutions are doing that. Ryzen has done that. We're in the process of developing one ourselves. Sheridan, Humber, like a lot of the education institutions are moving towards diversity self-ID projects. And again, I think it's so important that, as institutions or workplaces we go into every day, or even in terms of your organization, who's here and where are the gaps? Right? Representation says a lot. Let's just say, you're looking at potential members. They might want to know who's here, outside of sex and outside of gender, who's here. And if we're recognizing that, this is who's here, how are we supporting? How are we engaging? How are we celebrating? Right? How are we doing that? Because it's important to be seen and heard and recognized and celebrated. And so I think diversity self-IDs are very important. I don't know how I feel about, I personally, given my understanding and my knowledge around equity and diversity and bias, there needs to be I feel like there needs to be more context, more conversation, as opposed to just sending your results in. Yeah, I don't necessarily, that's not something I would support at all. with AI helping in recruiting, can racism and other biases be baked in? It can. Actually, that's a conversation I had with I think our project coordinator for our AI program at the college. It's like, because who is building the program? Right. And so again, this is where the conversations need to happen around implicit biases, because who is building the program? You're building the program through your lens, right? You're building the program, you're engaging with content, whichever, specifics that are put into the program is being built by someone. And so if there isn't another set of eyes, if there isn't someone who's applying an equity lens, right, to the programming, to all those other pieces, whatever is being developed for your lens. So which means that it carries your own, your biases, it carries your own worldview. So that is something that definitely there has to be ongoing conversation. There has to be unconscious bias training around these pieces for sure. There was a book that came out a couple years ago about AI and racism, algorithms of oppression, how search engines reinforce racism. Yes, so I was sick last year at a conference. Yeah, and I know that's some work is being done in that area around just how to even approach it, right? And so we see, and again, as I said, if you were to just think of, that upside down pyramid, if you were to think of that, and you think of the society and the structures. I recently took a look, there was an image on social media, and it was an image of our Supreme Court justices. And if you were to look at it, I don't see anybody who looks like me, but I also know that there are other areas of diversity that are probably invisible. But if you were to just take a look at it, and I think, is this person, and this is an assumption that I'm making, but I'm thinking, who on the Supreme Court of Canada would understand my lived experience as someone with African ancestry? What my experiences have been, what my ancestors' experiences have been. How is that considered in decision making? So if we look at the structural and the societal pieces, how it trickles down and it reinforces and it builds our system, you can see how racism, the impact of racism can really trickle in through the societal, the institutional, the systemic, and that emboldens, empowers, and reinforces the individual interpersonal, right? Because people feel empowered because, okay, our law said this, or, here's the exclusion happening here through policies and practices. And so therefore, I'm okay. I may not do it explicitly, but I'm okay. And so if it is within if those systems are not reviewed, if our systems, our structures are not, really looked at with that equity lens, then we'll continue to have these conversations, Any more questions for me? Any thoughts? Anything that you think, you wanted to learn a little bit more of, but I didn't touch on it? I know it's always, I try to put in the pieces. I, took a look at your values and your mission to kind of get a sense of who you are as an organization, your work around volunteerism and community building and advocacy. And I thought, here's some things that I think, it's important that we understand identity. How are you walking into a space? Always be mindful of that. That is so important, because then when you walk into that space, you're understanding how much space am I taking up in terms of the privilege that I enjoy, and how am I impacted, by oppression that, I might experience, whether it be for sexism or ableism or ageism, right? What does that look like? And so we need to have that foundational sense of self, right, before we can look at how we amplify voice, how we support, how we advocate, how we community build, and how we do allyship, so that we don't, we go in and we ask, folks, how can we support you? How can we best support you? And you might have a framework and you might have a great plan in place, and that's great, but how do you need to look at the needs, of the community that you're seeking to support as well, right? I read Dr. Kendi's, How to Be Anti-Racist, The Skin We're In, Desmond Cole, Policing Black Bodies, Robin Maynard. I have a whole list of resources actually that I can email to Nadine, and she can share that with you. Some of them will say specifically to educators, but it's applicable across the board. Dr. Robin DiAngelo's work on white fragility, I think is really important because I think sometimes when people do hear, the idea of white fragility, a defensive, like, people, your backs go up, but it just looks at how are we using, for lack of a better word, using whiteness, right? And then you look at, okay, do I use my privilege to support, to help, to advocate, or do I use my privilege in a way that weaponizes and further harms a particular group? And really that's what she talks about, is that, we feel that discomfort when we start to talk about racism. And so people go to a place where, well, I don't want to talk about this if this is causing me any, discomfort, or I might be feeling guilt. And it's like, it shouldn't be. It should be, okay, how do we now recognize these concepts, these ideas, the history? Again, as I said, I spoke with a group of faculty members yesterday, and when I asked if people understood or knew that we had a history of slavery, in Canada, and more than half of the faculty members said we didn't. And we do. We need to know our history. We need to understand that, because it's a lot of folks said, well, I thought, slaves left the US and made their way to Canada. And I said, yes, we had over 30,000, slaves come through the underground, railroad. But however, a lot of the folks who thought that coming to Canada, that they were going to be free, were not free. Right, they were further enslaved. And so there's a very extensive history when we look at our indigenous folks, when we look at, or Black folks who did come, and all the other, immigrants who made their way to Canada and their experiences as well. So there's definitely lots of resources. I'm happy to share that. I'll share a list with you that just looks at, how do we have these conversations, right? What does that look like? And how do we continue? It's important, it's important. I know it's important that we continue to dialogue, because we can ask questions. We need to ask each other questions. We do it respectfully. We engage. We recognize that our stories will be different. Our lived experiences will be different. And that we also recognize that we're not going to get it right away. We're not going to get it right in one sit-in. So we need to continue engaging and having conversations with each other. Absolutely. And that we recognize that intersectionality of all the other areas of social identity that we bring with it is as equally important, because we're experiencing exclusion, through some of those other identities as well. Okay.
Is it too late for questions or comments?
No, go ahead.
I just wanted to jump in. I felt kind of bad that you were talking and we're all kind of sitting quietly, but I loved your talk. And I think one of the things that I find that I struggle with a little bit, but also a lot of my friends struggle with, because we want to be good allies and we want to recognize our privilege. And I really like what you said about the fact that, privilege and oppression aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. They're not. Sometimes both are there. But there's a bit of a fear sometimes about speaking, having conversations, asking questions, because no one wants to get it wrong. No one wants to say the wrong thing. No one wants to be not in a cowardly way, but in a hurtful way. No one wants to hurt anyone unintentionally. And I think it's incredibly powerful to have that perspective of, you're trying to understand, you're always evolving, your perspective's always evolving, our societal perspective's always evolving, the conversation framework always shifts. So letting go of that guilt and being willing to ask questions while still focusing on, the privilege and the opportunity that we have individually to make changes, either in little ways or big ways, is so important and powerful. And it's really nice to have some of that language to use as well. So thank you for that, because that was very helpful for me personally. Yeah, thanks so much for your chat, for your talk.
You're welcome. And, and again, I say, ask the questions. I know I had people reach out to me after the George Floyd murder, and they said, well, I feel like I can't ask you for resources, and I'll be asking you to do the work. And I said, but we have to do the work together. And so therefore, if I'm going to do an additional labor of having to find it, but if it's something that I have, then I'm going to say, here you go, please take a look at it, but be committed to doing the work. right? Be committed to doing the work where, you know, it might be something where somebody might say, you know, hey, Allison, I was thinking, you know, what about this? Or I had somebody say this, you know, I had a conversation with a colleague, you know, who said, you know, I think I understand why, you know, why Black Lives Matter and that we shouldn't say all lives matter, but all lives do matter, right? And I said, absolutely. And so here's somebody who was very hesitant to even have the conversation with me. And I said, all lives should matter. This is what we're saying when we say Black Lives Matter, is that all lives should matter. But right now, in this moment, Black bodies are dropping. We are losing Black men. We're losing people who are violence is being perpetrated on their bodies. The Ontario Human Rights report tells us that Black bodies in Toronto are 6 times more likely to be policed. 6 times more likely to be policed. And so in this there's an urgency now that we need to say, hey, Black bodies are having, you know, violence perpetrated against them. Therefore, we need to respond to this urgent matter. And once we've dealt with that and our bodies, and we're not losing our partners and our, you know, dads and our siblings and our children, all lives should matter. And if all lives should matter, then we wouldn't be losing these Black bodies. You know what I mean? And so we had that conversation and she said, oh my gosh, like, okay, I hear you, right? And so what is the intention? So when somebody says to me, oh no, forget you, all lives matter, then that's a whole other conversation, because the intention is to dismiss what is happening and to not recognize. And we're, you know, the thing about it is I sometimes think, what if we didn't have the information coming at us so rapidly, and we didn't have people recording, you know, these murders, and what if we didn't even see it? Because it's right there to see, but yet people are dismissing the urgency, you know, that is within the Black community to say, we're scared. We're seeing people who look like us have a knee on their neck and be and be killed, right? And so this is where, you know, where, yeah, all life should matter, and really we should not be experiencing this, but right now there's an urgency. There's an urgency for us to address it, and that's why we're saying Black Lives Matter. Yeah. Yeah, so have the conversation. Don't hesitate to have it. You know, I had a friend of mine say to me, you know, after the George Floyd murder, she said, I don't even know what to say. So she just sent me an email with a heart emoji, because she said, I didn't have words and I didn't want to say the wrong thing the day after. And I said, that meant so much. You know, the people who just checked in with me to say, you're okay. And I'm like, I'm not, I haven't to this day watched this video. I cannot. I'm raising sons. I cannot watch it. I cannot, right? So, you know, people reached out, and that meant that they knew that I was hurting. That meant that they knew that the weight of it, I carried it, and I had to carry it, you know, and show up to work and show up, right? But I'm still showing up, you know, with that social identity of being a Black woman. Right, but I still have to show up. So how are we checking for each other, right? You know, if it was a situation of, you know, say sexism, or, you know, somebody, you know, as a violence against women, we're recognizing violence against women, you know, coming up in November. You know, if it was someone that we know, you know, had experienced violence, how are we showing up for them? So sometimes we don't have the words, and that's okay. We don't have the words to articulate it, but it's sort of the checking in. You know, can I ask you a question? I might get it wrong. I'll apologize if I do, right? And when have we? We're not always gonna get it right. Right, and I think there's a vulnerability that goes with that, allowing ourselves to say, you know, I want to learn. I might get the term wrong. I might not be able to articulate it well. Just bear with me. You know, if the intention is coming through, that the goal is to learn, and then the goal is to look at how can I be an ally, then please go for it. That shouldn't, we don't, you know, I don't want that to ever be a reason for people not to act, or not to get out of our comfort zone, right? That we might get it wrong. I had a physician say to me, I feel like I'm in the state of paralysis because I want to do something, but I don't know what to do, so I don't do anything. And I said, okay, we need to move beyond that. That's not okay. We cannot, we don't have the luxury anymore. And that's part of what, you know, Dr. Kendi, you know, talks about, is that, you know, we don't have the luxury to not act. We don't have the luxury to click like on a social media post. We don't have the luxury to just black out our social media and black out you. That's not enough. You know, we cannot be silent anymore when we see any sort of ism being perpetrated, right? We don't have the luxury. There's an urgency now, right? There's a different vibe in the air around, we talked before, what are we doing now, right? Yes. Yeah, absolutely. In terms
So
of
I have, oh, I don't know. Sorry, I just had a quick question based on that. I mean, everything you're saying is so relevant and so important. So based on all that, now we can have a sigh and we can breathe. What next?
Mhm. Mhm. And what next? How do you take this conversation, because you engaged, you initiated the conversation, we're having the conversation, I've shared, some of the concepts with you, and so now as an organization, look at what do we want to do with this? How do we apply an equity lens in the work that we do? How do we talk about, us as members within the different, areas, the different groups? I logged on a few minutes early, so I heard you talk about your different groups, your membership and your diversity committee. How do you apply an equity lens to the work that you do, to your events, to the people that you engage with, right? If you're doing work with someone and this person is someone who has, openly perpetrated ism, is this somebody we want to work with? Like, how do you definitively, be clear as an organization, this is who we are, right? This is who we are. This is, zero tolerance. We're, our practices have to be equitable. And when, someone said to me, but it sounds so big. And I say, if you were to take a look at your, your processes or your practices, and if you were to think off the top of your head, is there any one group that you think that you're harming? Is there harm? Because sometimes you're already doing some of the practices, you don't recognize it and name it as equitable practice. So when you're doing your advocacy work, when you're, looking at, the camaraderie between you as, as sisters, what does that look like? Who's being left out? Are people being left out? Or maybe ask each other. Like maybe, you ask people, when we talk about inclusion, it's an inclusive organized, and that could be the work that you do first as a group, as a membership, to see how people feel. Right? Do you feel included? Do you feel welcome? Do you feel celebrated? And if you don't, what does that look like? What needs to happen? So I usually say to organizations, look at your structure first, look at your practices first. And then you can kind of look at, okay, what does that mean with our external partners? What does that mean with the communities that we're engaging with? Yeah, that is what would be my what next. How do people feel? How are your members feeling? Now that we've talked about and we've looked at privilege and we've looked at oppression, my advice is always continue the conversation. Don't let this be the one and done. It's important that you continue the conversation and be honest with each other and be ready to receive, where somebody might say, hey, I felt sometimes where I've been excluded. We have to be prepared to receive it. It might not be what we want to hear, but that is okay. But we need to hear it so now we can address the gaps and then we can move on, right? And it's not always easy to receive it. And that's okay as well. The discomfort might be there, but that's not a bad thing. But then we need to address the gaps. Yeah. Talk about it. Keep talking. Yeah, keep talking. You've already initiated it. You've started it. You started the conversation, then keep talking.
Well, Allison, I just want to say thank you so very much for this great talk. And I need to say that being a woman of color and having the intersectionalities that I do, this still was such a great learning opportunity for me, and really allowed me to reflect on me and what I'm doing. How am I opening the conversation for others? How am I using my privilege to support people and celebrating them and ensuring their voices are heard? And there are just so many great things that you said. And one of the things that really struck me is that discomfort is not a bad thing. It's okay to feel that discomfort and then together move beyond it. And you also said, we do the work together. We don't do it by ourselves, right? And I think that this is something as a league that we need to embrace. We need to embrace the discomfort, and also embracing the fact that we do this work together. We learn about ourselves collectively and individually, and then we move forward as we learn that to support each other in becoming anti-racist, as well as working with our community partners and ensuring that this is the lens that they have. Yes. But you're right. the work starts with us, inside of us and inside of our organization, looking at our practices, our processes, our structures, and are they truly inclusive? So I think we've had an opportunity to learn so much about this topic, so much about ourselves already. And I think we need to really go back and reflect for ourselves. And thank you for this learning opportunity, Allison. It's been wonderful. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. And I really do hope you continue the dialogue. Absolutely.
Wonderful. Thanks very much.
You're welcome. Take care, everyone. Have a good one. Be well.
Take care. Take care, Allison. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
I definitely would agree that it was an incredible opportunity. And I think that for me, something that really stood out was when she said, when do you feel that sense of discomfort? And I think that when you feel that sense of discomfort is when you have the opportunity to grow as an individual. So lots of points to reflect after tonight's talk. And now we're going to change gears. So I would like to introduce you to Suzanne Lyle, Director at Large. She's now going to walk us through our contingency planning exercise.
Okay, so what I think we should do is, we've been sitting for a while, most of us. I think while Terry and I figure out handing over the hosting duties and everything, if everybody wants to get up and have a stretch or just move around a bit and give us a minute, I think, where's Terry? That she has to enable me the hosting and the slide sharing, I guess.
Yeah, I am here. Hang on here. So I'm going to stop recording. So is that okay, Jess? I've captured all the training. Yep. Okay.
Yes,
See you.
please.